My basic strategy, starting when I was probably around 10 or 11, was to write. And I've been writing poetry of some kind, every day since. So really, that has been my number one. And then obviously reading and writing and teaching and the profession that I have found myself in many ways lends itself to a cognitive existence where you're open to variety and change and adventure.
They said that we'd grow out of it. Well, the joke's on them, that's just our brains. We're eccentric, loud, and stubborn, and most of our clothing is covered in stains. It's not a deficit of attention, there's just too much to think about. So if executive dysfunction becomes a little too much, if you forgot why you came in this room, or you're hypersensitive to touch, then put on your seamless socks and come join our little flock. Bitches stimming together, we're weirds of a feather, weirds of a feather.
Okay, so we are officially recording. I'll do a bunch of editing and everything, so we can pause as much as we need. We can, re-say whatever. Just two friends chatting.
Yes, two
Yes.
friends chatting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I will start us off by saying welcome to Weirds of a Feather, an ADHD-adjacent podcast. I'm your host, Grace, and we're doing things a little differently today. We're making some bonus content for Patreon, and instead of Kristen in the studio today, I am joined by my good friend, John. Why don't you start us off by telling us kind of who you are, how we know each other, what your deal is?
All right. So I've known you, Grace, since before you were born, really.
Yes.
That is, I've been friends with your parents for a very long time. So I've had the pleasure of watching you emerge and emerge and emerge and emerge. And it's where you're sitting right now seems to me sort of like I could have imagined, even though I obviously couldn't, but that you would wind up where you are. Um, so who am I? I'm 76. I have had ADHD all my life, is what Grace tells me. The more I think about it, the more likely that seems. I'm an educator primarily. I'm a poet. I have 3 kids, none of whom would be at all startled by Grace's observations, in that they, like Grace, have grown up, uh, in my company. Much of Grace's life, my wife and the 3 kids and I were in and out of Maine, so that Grace has seen us kind of on a global, intercontinental level, acting out a certain degree of ADHD.
Yeah,
If you
just your
look at our
lifestyle
passport,
alone.
if you look at
Living.
our passports, it would suggest that we at least like to wander. Um, I'm currently, my wife and I have landed in Western Massachusetts. I've come out of retirement and am teaching high school English. And uh, yeah,
Yeah.
coping with myself, I suppose, is one of the is one of the things.
Yeah, you in particular seem like, as we've been discussing ADHD these last few years since I've kind of gone on my bender of learning about ADHD and then realizing how many people in my life are ADHD. You were obviously one of the first people that came to mind because you've lived such a big, full, adventurous life. But it also seems like you have been able to unknowingly come up with quite a few coping strategies for yourself without really realizing that's exactly what you were doing.
Yeah, I would assume that back when I started whatever the coping mechanisms are, uh, first of all, ADHD was not, I don't think it had yet emerged as an understanding. So as I look back, it certainly does explain some things. But in terms of coping, my basic strategy, starting when I was probably around 10 or 11, was to write. And I've been writing poetry of some kind, every day since. So really, that has been my number one. And then obviously reading and writing and teaching and the profession that I have found myself in many ways lends itself to a cognitive existence where you're open to variety and change and adventure.
Do you think the writing helps you organize your thoughts and kind of keep the mumble jumble onto the paper? Or is it more like it gives you a structure to come back to every day, or like a combination?
Well, it does both of those things. And I think that's what any practice does that
Mm.
has any meaning to it. It's both a structure and thus a daily reassurance, but it's also a way to open yourself up to to the to the chaos, if that's the right word, to the muddle, to the befuddled metaquisical condition. So yeah, I think that it's both things, Grace. It's both the discipline of every day,
Mm.
and it becomes identity in an acceptable way. People can then say, "Oh, he's a poet," and that explains that explains whatever. Um, I had a great experience. One of my friends has been going through their father's archives and boxes of this and that, and they found a letter that my mother had written to these the parents of my good friend about me, and I was in college, and she said, John writes us a lot, but we never really understand what it is that he's doing, because what he writes us are these endless poems that are lovely and full of details, but they don't really tell us you know how he's doing, what he's doing. And I enjoyed reading that because I thought, okay, in some ways it's not a smokescreen, it's not a camouflage, but it has been both a discipline, a means, and a persona that has allowed me to make my way to the age of 76, still upright, still cogent enough to teach a room full of high school high school students.
Yeah, that takes a lot of brain energy and guts, even to stand up in front of a room of high schoolers.
These days, we don't do much standing. It's more
Mm,
it's more like sitting in the company of.
the
Um,
metaphorical standing.
no, no, I understand. Although I do. It's a metaphor that is interesting because the role of teacher, and that's a whole, we could digress endlessly into the role of a teacher. But um, yeah,
Your writing to me feels like, in a way, that you kind of romanticize your life, like with the letters, you're not just writing, "Mom and Dad, I, made a new friend today. I went to class and studied at the library." It's like the way you put it into this prose really
Yeah.
does romanticize everything you do that would normally sound maybe mundane. So, I think it's lovely.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, romanticize is, one of those ambivalent or ambiguous things because, part of the problem if you do romanticize is you sometimes fail to actually deal with, but yeah, I as a writer, I think the idea is that you make of the ordinary something extraordinary.
Mm,
Because I think that is probably the fundamental, project of writing.
mm. Let's see. Well, I'm sure we'll just meander this whole interview. I do want to touch on kind of what you were like as a child and maybe looking back those ADHD traits that you notice in yourself. And at some point, I also want to talk about your 3-hour block schedule that you have told me about. That's kind of chaos within structure. But let's start with your childhood, kind of, yeah, what you were like, what you noticed looking back.
Well, what I notice about myself as I look back on it is that I was I think I was perplexed a lot, if that makes sense. Um,
Yes.
not not in a way that hampered me particularly. I stuttered a lot
That's
as
right. We've talked about
a and starting, I think, and again, the thing about being 76 is there's nobody to ask. You
that.
know, I could ask my sister, but she was only a few years older. Um, I would love to know more about when that began, when that stammering began. And I realize as we're talking, Grace, that obviously one of the reasons that writing became so important was it was a way to cope with or overcome the stammer.
Mm,
Uh, so I think that reality that I was, that I had a great childhood, but it was marked by a stammer
mm,
that led to my coping with that stammer by becoming a writer, an intellectual, you know, a student, things less directly physical
mm,
and more, a way to manage what felt like perhaps a kind of a devastating affliction.
Of course, it's so personal. It's, the way you communicate is how you move about the world. And when you're not able to get those words out and you're being misunderstood and people are, yeah, I mean, with all disabilities, people kind of make this judgment. And I've seen it a lot with stuttering, especially where people assume something about your cognitive ability or who you are just based on how you communicate.
And so, Grace, I set myself the project, I've realized, from a fairly early stage to set it up that nobody could do that to me.
Mm,
So I practiced at times, a kind of silence that people would then interpret as, and again, my mother is as if I was brooding or as if I was, lost in thought or as if I was, somehow other than other people, and not simply because I had this handicap, but because
mm,
that handicap was an indication of something more.
mm,
The simplest form. or the clearest form that that took. I only once during all of my childhood had sessions with a speech therapist.
I was going to ask about that.
And this is when I was in the sixth grade. And the therapist, what I remember, and again, you forget a lot of things, but one thing that he told me, he said, John, he said, Moses stuttered. And the reason that his brother Aaron became his spokesman is that Aaron did not stutter, but
Hmm.
Moses did. And I remember, Grace, that feeling like a validation,
Hmm.
like, oh, you know, this is not just an affliction. It's also a sign of something. And
Hmm.
so it set me feeling that I had some kind of a mission in the world that was represented by my writing,
Wow.
uh,
That's
if that
wonderful.
makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favorite things to do is rattle off a list of names of, people throughout history who were stutterers, who were autistic, who had ADHD. And yeah, especially as a child, feeling, being made to feel like you're never going to be able to maybe accomplish the same things as everyone else with this communication disability. Yeah, just hearing that someone like Moses was a stutterer. Charles Darwin was a stutterer. Lewis Carroll was a stutterer. Marilyn Monroe. Like there's so many people throughout history that were stutterers. So that's beautiful that with that one little comment, he was able to kind of maybe change the trajectory of your life a bit.
Well, it kind of has stayed with me as
Mm,
a way to think about not only my life but the life of those others who you then learn about. You say, that makes sense.
mm,
Uh, yeah, I was just talking with a friend of mine about Lewis Carroll, and you realize how, I mean, that is a wonderful example
mm,
of a turning of a deficiency, if that's what it is, into a source of great richness. Um,
mm. I had a wonderful stuttering professor in grad school, Barry Guitar. He like wrote the textbook on stuttering and everything. He's a fantastic little guy. But his I took a few classes with him and we worked on technique with, smoothing out stutters, being able to get into your sentence, being able to like move past those words when you're stuck. But his real whole mission, which I really appreciated, was what if this is just a different way of communicating? What if instead of looking at this as just something to fix and make normal and cover up, that we also at the same time treated it as a different way of communicating, and we all kind of worked on our patience of, allowing someone the time to speak, get their thoughts out. And yeah, I really liked his approach to stuttering, that it wasn't this just shameful thing to fix immediately. And
yeah,
they
I
all,
think. Mm,
well, I was going to
go-
say that stuttering also is, he talked about it as taking the back roads through your brain from your language center to your mouth as opposed to taking the highway. And in a way, I think that's kind of lovely. And I do think it goes along with who you are as a person. You like to meander, and it makes sense that your thoughts just need a little more time to meander.
yeah, one of my current students, who uh, who I really appreciate. She at some point, a couple of weeks into our time together, she said, "John, I've noticed that you speak very slowly." And I thought about that. I thought that was a good observation.
Hmm.
That I do appreciate, you know uh, a pace of conversation that allows there to be silence. It allows there to be, kind of a working things out. And whether, what it has to do with being an introvert, an extrovert, I think a stutterer who's an extrovert
Mm,
has a very different challenge than one who's an introvert. Um, and as I look back at myself, I mean, well, what I've been told, Grace, about myself is that I chattered more than I stuttered
mm,
until I got sort of into school, second grade, third grade, when the chattering was not allowed and you had to speak only when it was your time to speak.
mm,
And I found that extremely uncomfortable.
I bet.
Uh, oh man, I, uh, you know, uh, whether it was to speak or to read, that
Mm.
like thing of going around the room and reading, I dreaded that experience. Um,
Would you get stuck on your words more when you were put on the spot like that?
yeah, yeah,
Mm,
and it's not it is getting stuck because you had to use those words,
mm,
whereas I'd gotten used to being able to kind of work my way around the anticipated word and say, oh, okay,
mm.
I'll figure out another way to say that.
That's very interesting you say that because that is, they talk about is that a good strategy or a maladaptive strategy? But if it works for you, I say it's a good strategy. But that is a strategy that we talked about in grad school where some people kind of, you wouldn't even know that they were a stutterer because they're always doing that mental work of avoiding, whether it's certain sounds that they get stuck on or certain words that they know where they'll kind of, yeah, mosey around those words.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean that is, if I think about my life, I think that pattern is evident of figuring out how to get around what would be difficult, and difficult obviously to some extent in terms of ego and pride and self-esteem.
Mm.
Um, yeah,
My professor also talks about how with stuttering I really found it interesting because it's so psychology based because it's not just a pure communication deficit. It's you're creating that feedback loop of those most important words, those most important communication aspects. Those are really the things that become most difficult. If it's a high pressure situation, someone asks you your name, like my friend Ben in grad school, he was a stutterer and he had a really hard time when he would be put on the spot and someone would ask him his name because it's such a high value piece of information, and then you feel that shame in the moment when you can't get that word out, and that just creates that feedback loop for next time. You're obviously going to feel even more stressed and more shame, and of course you're going to be tensed up and you're going to stutter. So yeah, it's really, I find it very interesting.
yeah, it is. My my mother tells the story of, I think I must have been four or so, and my parents went off and left my sister and me with a family friend, and this family friend was apparently a very fierce believer in kind of discipline.
Mm,
And my parents didn't necessarily know that. And when I had a hard time saying certain sounds, she apparently, I think we were with her for 2 weeks. I think she was very fierce with me.
mm.
And my mother always says that that was a turning point, that I became much more sort of self-conscious about
Mm.
what was before then just a difference.
Yeah, a lot
So
of
I
kids,
think,
when they hit that point of maybe being bullied, whether by adults or classmates in school, that's really when the stutter actually kind of like takes off and becomes even more severe because, yeah, you
yeah,
become aware of it.
yeah. But it's the most fun because I spend a fair amount of time with my classmates from back in my childhood. My
Mm.
my high school class, we get together regularly
Oh, wow.
on Zoom,
Mm.
and this never comes up. Nobody ever says, "Hey, John, I remember that you were a stutterer," because
Hmm.
and you realize that you get caught up in your own self-consciousness,
Hmm.
and you're not really aware of what the world thinks of you. You get distracted by what you think of yourself. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, yeah, my childhood. Yeah, I mean, speech was all the way through a really important thing until when I graduated from high school. I was the valedictorian and I spoke, and I felt very, validated by that because I'd been asked to speak.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that's incredible.
yeah.
Do you find that when you have structure to your words, it's easier to get it out than if you're trying to kind of think on the spot? Like if you know, do you practice what you're going to say at all?
Well, it's really interesting. I went for a long time writing things that I couldn't read. So my poetry for a very long time, I had a very hard time reading out loud.
Hmm.
And it's only recently, and recently meaning the last, probably 25 years, that I've really been able to find a way to write that allows me to feel confident.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
so I do like preparing what I'm going to say, but it tends to be not a. I tend to not read it. I
Hmm.
tend to use it as a scaffolding for what I'm going to say. Um,
Hmm.
but it's funny because I have, what has emerged is that I'm often asked to speak, which is an interesting thing when I think back on how hard that was.
Hmm.
So I think, okay, this has been a lifelong, you know, project, uh,
Yeah. I mean,
including,
even
telling you stories on the porch of our summer camp. I mean that was part of this gaining.
hmm,
Yeah.
that's a good audience to practice for.
Oh my gosh, you guys were the best,
I love those stories, Mr. Bottom or Dr. Bottom. Sorry,
Dr.
forgot his
Bonham.
title.
Oh my. Yeah. So I would add to it that really my sort of hero as a child was my mother's father, my grandfather, and he was a tremendously articulate public speaker.
Hmm.
I always admired his uh, his way with words.
Hmm. Yeah, it's very brave of you to, speak as much as you do. You officiated my wedding. I mean, talking in front of once again, the idea of teaching in front of a bunch of high schoolers terrifies me. And then I can't imagine also, yeah, kind of having that in the back of your head that the stutter is there and it's something to kind of always work around. And it's very brave of you to have that challenge and move through it anyways.
Yeah, I don't. I yeah. No, thank you. I hear that. I am mindful. What I find interesting about being back in a school, that what I have the hardest time with is just kind of everyday, ordinary conversation.
Mm. When there's no
And
structure to it.
yeah, when there's no structure. And it's not that I'm afraid of stuttering in that case. It's just I sort of run out of speech. It's like, oh,
Mm.
what am I? So, the case in point would be sitting around the lunch table with a group of colleagues. I find myself becoming quiet.
Mm.
And I realize it's because I'm used to engaging in conversation out of my own particular language and articulation world. Um,
So, you and I have talked about autism a bit as well in our conversations. And a big thing that I am realizing about myself and autism in general, because I now know that I am AuDHD, which is autistic and ADHD. And I have found that I also have a very hard time with those unstructured conversations where you don't have like a set topic. There's not something that you're discussing. There's not, one topic you're supposed to be talking about. It's kind of loose. You're supposed to be kind of asking questions or, on the spot coming up with where you want to go next in the conversation. And I also have a very hard time with that. Whereas when we have a set subject like autism and ADHD, I could talk forever and ever. Like you and I have wonderful long conversations about it. But yeah, put me in a room and say, okay, talk to this person. I'm like totally out. My brain goes blank.
yeah, I have that. I have
Mm,
that issue, and at times I at somebody asked me how I'm finding being back at work, and I just not blurted out, but it came to mind that at times it's almost humiliating.
mm,
And I thought to myself, John, what are you saying? And it is that self that I had cultivated
mm,
um, in the setting where there's unstructured, back and forth, especially in a room full of, 15 high school seniors. At times, I feel very almost, yeah, almost mortified by the fact that I
mm,
don't quite know what to say.
mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's like, oh, how am I supposed to respond to this? Um,
Yeah.
and you realize that's sort of a lifelong thing.
Mm.
That if you add ADHD, stuttering, and the autistic, yeah, at times it can be very difficult. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I feel that social shame a lot I feel like most conversations with people who I'm not totally comfortable with, and that brings up the topic of masking which happens with ADHD and autism. With ADHD, you're masking, your impulsivity to be looking around, to be interrupting them, to be, bringing up a random topic or whatever. So there's masking in that sense. But then with the autism, I do feel a bit like an alien pretending to be a human and trying to think of like, okay, what would a human ask this person right now?
uh,
And I do, yeah. And then after I leave the conversation, I'm, thinking it back through, over analyzing. Did I say anything weird? Did I, talk about myself too much? Did I ask them enough questions? And it's just, yeah, kind of that perpetual feeling of like an alien trying to blend in with human life.
yeah, I was out sick for 4 days, and I came back to work, and I felt like Rip Van Winkle. And it was not an alien. It was just like I had been asleep and I'd woken up in a world which I didn't fully understand. Um,
Mm,
and Grace, I it's always been for me also the like the world of today uh, is complicated because it's different enough from the world that I grew up in that I find myself very aware that I could put my foot into something that I didn't mean to. So I
mm,
become in that way also self-conscious
mm,
about pronoun use, about, all of the kind of hetero cisgender cliches which I carry around in my head.
mm,
Um, you know, and as you said, masking, not wanting to reveal those. Um,
mm,
so it's a complicated, and that's been true forever. I mean
mm,
I grew up in a world where where the differences were so stark
Mm.
that you were mindful of that like as you said, where do you fit? Where do you belong? Am I an exile, an expat?
Yeah, well, you've experienced a bunch of different cultures as well, moving all around the world. So I'm sure that has also, added a layer of having to kind of navigate that and also probably developing some skills in that and knowing that you're going to, step in it. Sometimes you're going to put your foot in your mouth accidentally, do something, that you didn't realize was culturally offensive or, not how things are done in that place. And yeah, I'm sure that gave you some navigational skills at least.
Oh, for sure. And it also reinforced a persona game of who you are. And
Mm,
for like me now, that is complicated by the being 76. And
mm.
so it's like there are just all of these, interesting complications.
There's something called rejection sensitive dysphoria that happens with ADHD and autism, where your nervous system has this really extreme reaction to a real or perceived rejection or shame. And I think that also plays a part, especially when you kind of see yourself as someone who, cares a lot about social justice and, wants everyone to feel welcome and comfortable, and you never want to offend anyone. And you kind of see yourself as this intellectual. It can feel so shameful to make a mistake like that, especially I'm sure at your age with, yeah, things like pronouns. And it's just not the world you grew up in. You're probably not, well, I guess working in the high school now, I'm sure you're around it a bit more. And I'm sure your
Oh,
children
I mean,
educate you on that as well.
I'm up to my, in these issues because the school where I'm working is an all girls school,
Mm,
and it's a very inclusive all girls school, and so that means that and, I'm living, I'm moving around in a world, significantly different
mm,
than the world, even though obviously over the years the change has been apparent, and I haven't been adverse in
mm,
any way to it, but because I've been retired for 4 years, uh, you realize what I mean. That gave me huge chunks of time when I was just by myself,
mm,
and so I was able to obviously do a lot of writing and reading and thinking, but not as much interacting.
mm. Yeah, it's hard when I think it's that perfect storm of like the autism, the ADHD, I'm sure your age plays into that too, where you're just it's so easy to just say something accidentally, or get feedback that you weren't expecting. And then, that adds a whole nother layer with the autism where an unexpected turn in the conversation or whatever can totally throw you off, make you shut down and want to go hide in bed.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely, absolutely.
All right. So I do want to hear about your 3-hour daily schedule that you were telling me about that you were probably doing when you were retired, I'm guessing.
Well,
But I
no,
found it
this
interesting.
this practice began way back. Um, it began really probably in my 50s, where I realized that I kind of wanted to have a map for myself of how to manage the variety of demands
Mm,
that I was living with, which included obviously my own demand on myself.
mm.
So I developed what my kids love to refer to. I call it healthy, wealthy, and wise, and it's sort of my poor Richard's daily agenda. And I try to every morning, sort of lay out the day in categories by kind, and sort of see if I can get myself through the day having accomplished the variety of tasks. And when I, at the end of the day, look at the variety of tasks, I say, John, how could you possibly have intended to do all of those things?
Mm.
Uh, so that is in a very general sense what I do, and I have both perfected it and realized how futile it is. but so it's sort of it's an exercise which I enjoy, and it allows me to be mindful of the variety of things that we all every day are asked to be or
Mm.
asked to do. Um, and when you're retired, it's much simpler because there aren't nearly as many. But this idea now that I'm putting 8 hours a day into being a teacher, the amount of time for the other things, if you're going to include the Boston Celtics, which you have to
Mm.
include, and
You have
you
to.
know, morning coffee and afternoon glass of wine, the amount of time available is um, seriously limited.
So
So
you
my
kind of make yourself a loose structure, or you pretend it's going to be maybe more of a strict structure, which you know in your heart will not play out that way, which I find many AuDHDers tend to do, where we have these grand plans for what the day will look like. We'll somehow be able to follow this super strict, rigid structure that we've never been able to do. But within that, you kind of give yourself chunks to do different like areas of interest.
Yeah,
And it sounds like that helps you get going and give yourself some structure, but then within that you give yourself a lot of kind of wiggle room where maybe you're into the writing, and then writing becomes that whole 3-hour chunk, and then you kind of shift what you were intending to do to the next day and the next day, and it just continues that way.
yes, yeah. And as my daughter Thomason says, Dad, the consequence for you is that you've had so many incredible ideas, and so few of them have actually come to fruition.
I relate to that.
And yeah, I mean that I think is true. And I
mm,
find that even now that I'm inclined to, in the excitement of the moment, have great ideas about what we're going to do as a class or what we're going to and making that happen for an ADHD
mm.
person, I assume, is a particular challenge, and that's where something like writing gives me uh, the the space and the form within which I can accomplish.
Yeah, that follow through has always been the hardest for me, working in the schools as a speech therapist. I had 45 students, and I would spend hours and hours and hours coming up with these grand plans of what I'm going to do for this one student. And I would throw all of my energy into it, all of my effort, and I either would spend so much time planning that I wouldn't actually have the energy to follow through and make it happen, or I would, but even then I've only planned for one student and I still have 44 left.
That's that is the and so you have to develop a sense of humor
Mm.
and patience and an awareness that in as they say in all programs of recovery, it's not really up to you in any
Mm.
grand way. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I um, I find myself aware of how many of my students are in the grips of this same. It's not a demon. It's whatever. It's a form that your energy takes.
Mm.
Um,
It's a good way to put it. So, do you find that kind of since learning this about yourself, and since, I I'm sure it has made you maybe gentler with yourself, but on top of that, has it also helped you just understand those students better, know how to support them better, kind of show them more grace in class?
Yes, it's also made me very impatient with school. And I've always been impatient with school because, it's so unlikely in my case, in my discipline, that you're going to get 15 people to, for the next 55 minutes, give their attention to, you know, a 20th century novel. That is,
Mm,
the odds of that are so much against what you're doing that it's like
absolutely.
at times and it's also, Grace, every book that I teach, and I think I can say this without exception, basically supports the idea that what you're doing in the class reading that book is antithetical to what the author of the book understood about the world. And so
Mm,
you're in this just it's a it's a bit of Sisyphus. You push the rock up to the top of the hill every day and it
mm.
rolls back down, and so you have to be aware that for your students, the 55 minutes they have with you uh, are just 55 minutes in their day, which is very complicated. And so I have to be patient and mindful of what can be done.
I think even that understanding alone is so meaningful, I'm sure, to your students because how many teachers are out there that do just kind of want to force kids into what we should accept is an unnatural way of being. And, just because you want it to be so doesn't make it so. And I think even just you recognizing that just because you want them to sit there and listen for 55 minutes, it absolutely does not mean it will happen. And I think that's where a lot of teachers get frustrated by the system that was kind of set up for you to fail, essentially.
Well, a lot of people have argued that its intent was to mortify people into behavior,
Mm,
is to just kind of, force you into, okay, I will not speak, I will, et cetera, et cetera. Um,
yeah, absolutely. And we know that does not work with ADHD, especially, which, is part of the reason why we have such a hard time in school, I think, for the most part, unless you are able to kind of internalize it and become a good rule follower. But I was never able to do that. And I was always kind of butting heads with teachers who didn't seem to understand that I just wasn't going to learn that way. And it felt like instead of trying to change it, which, that's a big ask for a teacher who has a classroom full of kids who are all neurodiverse and have different ways of learning. But yeah, it always felt like you can either choose to join or you can kind of be a problem kid or an outcast. And there's not really that in between of like, all right, how do we meet the student where they are, find ways to excite them, in a way that works for their brain.
yeah, and I think I do a reasonably good job with that, but
Mm,
it's frustrated by the demands of a school year, and you know that at this time everybody should be at the same place,
mm,
and that basic premise is so silly.
mm,
And yet that's what we do is we've just finished our first trimester, and so it's suddenly all the grades and things are due, and everybody's running around in a lather about, oh my God, how did I get you know can't you change that? And it's like, surely that's not what this is all about.
mm. Yeah, it feels silly. Kind of feels
It
silly.
does. It does.
Hmm.
I hope that my school head doesn't listen to this podcast, but um,
I doubt they will.
uh, uh, maybe. Um,
So, let's see. I also wanted to ask you about, just we've talked mostly about ADHD. You can throw autism in there as well if you feel comfortable, but I did want to hear you speak on kind of the ADHD traits you've noticed in yourself since we've started talking about them in the last few years, or kind of, I guess, what's changed since you had this realization about yourself? Which, you always knew this about yourself, but finally had the language to talk about it.
That's a great question, Grace, because I've been very very grateful to you for having sort of taken the bold move of in a sense sitting me down and telling me what you'd observed, because I think we tend to not do that with each other.
Hmm.
So I like that.
People
Um,
don't always like it, so I'm appreciative of you that you are receptive to that and have enjoyed having these conversations because it's super fun for me.
and what I appreciate so much is that it's of interest to you.
Mm,
Whereas I think in some other instances I can think of, that my becoming aware of this is not of great interest. Perhaps to other people, it's like, oh, okay, fine, cool, but that's not, you know, that's not really. It's not really what we're interested in.
yeah, they don't
Um,
want to like analyze in the way that we do.
yeah, and to take pleasure in kind of you know meandering around in the midst of it.
Hmm.
So, like we are as a family, we're going to gather, and I think it's a really interesting thing to
Hmm.
have this idea, because I think that my kids are not at all surprised. And in fact, they would, I think, say, Dad, we've known this for a very long time. Um,
Yes.
so it'll be interesting,
Hmm.
how that plays out in our dealings. We then have a granddaughter who's 3.5,
That's
and
right.
it's so interesting to hang out with her,
Hmm.
and to like see a person at the beginning of this whole you know long uh, this long journey, um,
Hmm.
and language and awareness and all of that coming into her
Hmm. Yeah, it's
her
wonderful to kind of watch that from the beginning.
it's amazing. It's sort
Hmm.
of like having watched you, you know
All right. So
from
looking back,
the beginning.
would you say that you noticed maybe some ADHD traits in me as a child that when I told you about it as an adult, you said that makes sense?
Yeah, I think it did make a lot of sense to me, Grace. Not because I could say, oh, that's why she behaved the way she did or
Hmm.
whatever, but I think it just made me aware that we all live our childhood in the emerging self-awareness that we gain with parents who are not necessarily always able or willing or have the time to really pay attention.
Hmm.
And so you're having to do it to some extent on your own.
Hmm.
And so I that's what I think about when I think about you and your childhood, is I think to myself, you were to some extent, and I think my kids feel this also, on your own.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, ADHD, autistic people, I think that's more true,
Hmm.
because there's
Absolutely.
not, because the awareness of all of this is only come recently.
I also think when you have parents who, because it's so genetic, it seems like most, if not all of your children have gotten your ADHD. But I think when you have parents like mine who also are neurodivergent, never had any awareness of it, because it wasn't really talked about back then, and they've kind of come up with strategies and ways to either manage it themselves or kind of force themselves into this way of being. that when you have a child growing up that way and you don't have the language for it and you don't know what's going on, the expectation is kind of like, well, just do it. Just make yourself do it. Just kind of force yourself into this box. And yeah, I mean, obviously I have wonderful, loving parents and they did a great job raising me, but I do feel like that component was missing from, I'm sure, a lot of kids growing up with, boomer parents or older who just, yeah, they weren't able to see it in themselves. And so they weren't able to recognize it in us. And therefore they weren't able to kind of like highlight it or grow it or help us kind of find new ways to move through the world that would, work with our brains. It was kind of just sit, sit down and force yourself to be a certain way.
And we abdicate so much to schools that
Mm,
it's really, I mean, when you think about your childhood, the percentage of time you spent not with your parents,
mm,
and not only not with your parents, but nowhere near them, is just so high. One of my favorite ADHD stories, Grace, and I think I've shared it with you. Um, Aaron and I, now Aaron, have taken groups of students off into India,
mm,
and you know, one of my favorite students, very 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 ADHD, incredibly hard to teach.
mm,
Just I first noticed him on the bus, our first bus ride, and he was just at the window, just looking out with this big-eyed, just look of wonder. And then later on, 3, 4, 5 days later, we wind up in a village up in the mountains of India. And the first morning, I come out, and I'm one of the early risers, and he's already up, and he's sitting, looking out at the village as it wakes up and at the mountains, and he was just he had a look I had never seen on his face. And
mm,
I sat down with him. I said, "So, Simon, what's going on?" He said, "John, nobody in this village is ADHD." And I said, "Simon, what do you mean?" He said, "Just look. There is so much to do, and everywhere you turn is part of your world.
mm,
It's like you're there's no there's no being left out, or everybody has a place and knows and does and goes." And he was just so mesmerized and moved by the fact that there are realities on the planet where the ADHD autism that we struggle with or let define us are not required or are not needed or are not no. Was he romanticizing? For sure,
mm,
but he was also getting at the fact that when you live in a world that integrated, you belong.
mm. That's beautiful. Yeah, I think that's the key component of it. It's not that, people will act like all of a sudden ADHD and autism are this big thing and why is everyone autistic these days? But obviously, this type of brain structure has existed, the entire time in humans. It's just a different brain wiring. It's something you're born with and it's just a different way that your brain operates. And it's just that within our culture where we've decided a very strict way of being and a strict way of doing things, and you're not allowed to go outside of those lines, it becomes a disability. It becomes a problem. Not saying that autism wouldn't be disabling in some ways, in a different culture, but you're not going to see, I think, those big problems like we see in Western civilization where we're expecting kids to sit down and learn a very specific way and follow these very specific rules. It's very punishment based, which, is terrible for the ADHD brain. It's very shame based. And then you go to a culture where, like everyone, like you said, everyone has a job, everyone has a place. If you are ADHD or autistic, you have different strengths, and they will find a way to encourage those strengths because great, we have someone who will notice the very fine details and be able to do this fine detail work, or will notice someone who has ADHD and wants to be doing something different every day, and they can bring that enthusiasm and like creativity to the table. And yeah, it's wonderful where you can see this place where kind of all neurotypes are embraced and encouraged instead of trying to be just like
And
flushed out.
and you belong to a village
Mm,
rather than to a it's so we it's not clear what we belong to.
mm,
You know what I mean? Maybe a family, maybe this, maybe, but when you grow up in a village and it's a subsistence village, that's where you belong. And you as a child, you go out and you interact with such a variety of people
mm,
that it's not, I mean, I think about, let's say, summertime in Maine. The summertime in Maine is bliss because you're interacting with so many other people
mm,
in a relaxed, informal kind of a way. I think about, your family camp or our camp. It was a place where like you would come and you got to hang out with me, you got to hang out with Bet, you got to hang out with other kids in a very relaxed, informal setting.
mm.
Uh, I think that the more of that happens, the better. And the other thing, Grace, you asked me about my like childhood. We played a lot,
Mm,
and what that meant is that you went out and you improvised with your friends, games and competitions and adventures without adult management. And I think that allowed us to use our variety of skills. I think about, you know, 10, 15, 20 of us getting together on a Saturday morning and deciding, okay, let's play some game
Duckba.
and duckba or capture the flag or whatever. And everybody had a part.
Mm,
You know what I mean? So you were improvising within the diversity of the people. So I think that the importance of play in my childhood really, and fantasy and uh,
yeah. I think that's huge, especially, for all children, but especially I think for the autistic brain. I've seen a few people lately talking about how beneficial improv can be for autistic people. And I think
yeah.
that's a big part of it. I think with autism, you can be very rigid and internalize the rules, especially if, they're shame based, where you got in trouble for not following this rule. So now it's like you are the upholder of this rule. You will uphold it over everyone, and you will be so rigid about it. You'll be rigid about the way things should be done. And I think that play and that improv kind of gets you out of that rigid, structured way of thinking and opens you up to your creativity, because with autism and ADHD, you do have a lot of creativity in there, but we can get so caught up on that rigidity that we kind of, I think, yeah, lose that fantasy side of ourselves. And I do think it's very important to, access that and not just fall into that very rigid rule following.
So let me read you this poem.
Yes, please.
Okay. So do we need to contextualize it?
Yeah, why don't you describe kind of what's going on and why you wrote it?
So Grace, you and your mother and my wife and I, we went off on a walk. And in those days and now, I'm the slowest of the walkers. Partially because my eyesight is not very good, and so I'm a little slow. Um, and so you very kindly, walked at my pace, and we got started talking, And what I realized is that as we got talking, I walked with increasing lack of concern about whether I was going to stumble over a route or, get lost. And so I found our conversation and the walk that we took, the walking and the talking complemented each other very nicely.
Hmm.
And so when I came home from that, I wrote this, and it is called Metaphor as a Guidance System for Grace. The path became, well, easy to negotiate. The molehill ceased to pretend to be a mountain. And we walked as pilgrims do, step by step, sharing for a moment at least, became a communication. You and I fell easily, step by simple step, into talking and walking. Attentive, focused. You and I walked on a path rugged enough for an old man to pay attention to more than where to step next. A watershed share. You and I walked on a path rugged enough I would normally be cautious, afraid of roots, but conversation. We talked of ADHD and autism, took my mind off my next step, and the path became, well, easy to negotiate. The molehill ceased to pretend to be a mountain, and the wilderness, in its domesticated form, what borders a cemetery, welcomed us. A trail somebody cleared enough for a Sabbath saunter we took together. Our minds' feet nimble, sure. We discussed system, how the state attempts to monopolize. The path became, well, easy to negotiate. Where the next route crosses made sense. The next stone branch made sense. Our attention commensurate, common, in common with each other, the others, our kin. In the best sense, then, wilderness, wildness, the whole thing became like a backyard, and we talked freely as inhabitants of a watershed do, and roots became a communication, became a communication. We found, yes, common ground, what we share, pay attention to. Yes, you and I fell easily, step by step, into that walking friends do, or fellow pilgrims sojourn together. Then where to step next? A watershed share. When mind and body, the mind's feet, take steps around roots, obstacles, the path became, well, easy to negotiate. For an old man, at least, the path, his attention commensurate. Metaphor, our guidance system.
It's beautiful.
An ADHD poem. So it is learning how to let the form of the poem match the nature of your mind. So
Mm.
I'm getting there, uh, step by step. And you're talking with me about all this, Grace, has been very, very both timely, helpful, entertaining, and fun.
That's wonderful to hear. I've had a blast, having a conversational partner to talk about all of this stuff with as well. And yeah, I've just really enjoyed hearing about how your interesting mind works and your observations about the world. And yeah, you always have interesting things to say.
So I would, as we sort of move towards the end of this, I would encourage whoever is interested in ADHD and poetry um, to read Walt Whitman's Song of Myself,
Hmm.
and read it either in the 1855 version where there are no sections. So it's just a long, ADHD meander, or the final version where there are 52 sections. And I like the 52 sections because you can read one a week
Hmm.
and you have a year with Whitman. And he has a great deal to say about ADHD and autism,
Hmm.
although he wrote long before any of those terms were available.
But
Um,
you recognize it in the way that he speaks about the world.
and the way that he writes, so
Hmm.
he invented free verse, and free verse is literally a gift to all of us who are, whose minds don't fit into the sonnet or the, and it does make you realize the absolute genius of somebody like Shakespeare, who is able to do it all within those constraints. But
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, I think those constraints can kind of stop us from doing it. So, yeah, that's a good recommendation.
and I'll finish my little piece here by quoting the opening of Song of Myself. Okay,
Okay.
and it goes like this, Grace. It goes, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. And to me, that invitation that we should loaf really, it it's what all of us, whether we're ADHD or not, but in particular those of us who are ADHD, need to often just give it a break. The relentless, self-consciousness,
Hmm.
and invite our souls, which are perhaps that in us which is before or beyond whatever may have afflicted us.
Well, that was
So,
wonderful.
Grace, thank you for inviting me to this.
Thank you for
And I
joining me.
look
I'm so
forward,
glad I was finally able to get you on the podcast.
yeah.
It's been a long time coming.
So let me know when you have sort of edited and whatever, and send me a link because I would, one, love to listen to it, and two, share it with friends and family.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. I will. All right, John. Well, thank you for joining me on our podcast, Weirds of a Feather. We do this thing at the end of the show where we squawk out, where you kind of make a bird call. So if you could give us your best bird call, we can end it right here.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Woo! Woo! Woo!
That was good. Ah! Ah! All
Perfect.
right.
Perfect.